On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman Empire, one of the greatest powers in history, did something unthinkable. The government announced that it could no longer pay its debts. The interest payments on foreign loans, which had been faithfully made for decades, would be halved. And then even those reduced payments would be suspended. It was a default. The Ottoman Empire, which had once besieged Vienna, which had controlled 3 continents, which had ruled over 50 million souls, was bankrupt. The announcement sent shockwaves through the financial markets of Europe. In London, Paris, and Vienna, bondholders watched in horror as the value of their Ottoman securities collapsed. Fortunes were wiped out overnight. Respectable families, who had invested in what they thought were safe government bonds, suddenly faced ruin. But the real tragedy was not in the counting houses of Europe. It was in Constantinople, in Anatolia, in the Arab provinces, where the bankruptcy would trigger a cascade of disasters that would ultimately destroy the empire itself. The Ottoman Bankruptcy of 1875 is the story of how a government can lose control of its finances, how foreign debt can become a trap, how desperate borrowing leads to dependency, and how that dependency can cost a nation its sovereignty. It is a warning from history that echoes loudly today. To understand how the Ottoman Empire went bankrupt, you have to go back to the beginning of the 19th century, to a time when the empire was still powerful but already starting to fray. The Ottoman Empire had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, and the Middle East for over 400 years. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire held together by military force, bureaucratic efficiency, and the prestige of the Sultan Caliph. But by 1800, the empire was falling behind. While Europe was industrializing, building factories and railroads, developing new technologies and military systems, the Ottoman Empire remained largely agrarian and traditional. The old military system, based on the Janissary corps and feudal cavalry, was obsolete. European armies with modern rifles and artillery could defeat Ottoman forces with ease. This became painfully clear in a series of wars. Russia defeated the Ottomans repeatedly, seizing territory around the Black Sea. Greece won its independence in the 1820s. Egypt, nominally an Ottoman province who broke away under Muhammad Ali and nearly conquered Constantinople itself in the 18th. The empire was losing wars, losing territory, and losing prestige. The Ottoman elite understood that reforms were necessary. If the empire was to survive, it had to modernize. It had to build a Western-style army, a modern bureaucracy, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. This period of reform, known as the Tanzimat, began in 1839 and continued for decades. The intentions were good. The problem was that modernization costs money, enormous amounts of money. The Ottoman government had limited revenue. The tax system was inefficient and corrupt. Tax collectors in the provinces skimmed off most of the revenue before it reached Constantinople. The religious foundations, the Wukfas, controlled vast amounts of land and were exempt from taxation. The foreign merchants, protected by treaties called capitulations, paid little or no tax. The government was trapped in a pre-modern fiscal system while trying to fund modern institutions. There was a gap between revenue and expenses, and that gap was growing every year. At first, the Ottomans tried to close the gap with domestic borrowing. The government issued bonds called Qaim paper notes that paid interest, but the domestic market was small. There was not enough capital in the empire to fund the scale of modernization that was needed. So the Ottomans turned to foreign lenders. In 1854, during the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire took out its first foreign loan from British and French banks. The loan was for £3 million at 6% interest. It was used to finance the war against Russia, which the Ottomans fought alongside Britain and France. The loan was supposed to be temporary, a one-time measure to pay for a specific crisis, but it opened a door that would never be closed. The Ottoman government discovered that European banks were willing to lend large sums of money quickly, and European banks discovered that the Ottoman government was desperate enough to accept almost any terms. It was the beginning of a debt spiral that would consume the empire. Between 1854 and 1875, the Ottoman Empire took out 15 major foreign loans, totaling over £200 million. That is an almost incomprehensible sum for the time, equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars today. Where did this money go? Some of it went to legitimate reforms. The Ottoman government built railroads, modernized the army, established schools, and expanded the bureaucracy. The military was re-equipped with modern rifles and artillery. A new fleet was purchased. The infrastructure of the empire was being dragged into the 19th century, but much of the money was wasted, stolen, or spent on luxuries. The Sultan Abdulaziz, who ruled from 1861 to 1876, was extravagant to the point of madness. He built enormous palaces along the Bosphorus, filled with imported furniture, crystal chandeliers, and European art. He maintained a harem of hundreds of women. He traveled to Europe on lavish state visits, showering gifts on foreign dignitaries, trying to project an image of wealth and power. The irony was that the empire was broke, but the Sultan was spending as if the treasury was bought. The money was borrowed in the Sultan's name, but it was spent on the Sultan's pleasures. The people saw none of it. Worse, the terms of the loans were predatory. The European banks knew the Ottomans were desperate. They charged interest rates between 6 and 12%, which was high but not outrageous. But they also imposed massive fees and discounts. A typical loan would be issued at face value, say £5 million, but the Ottomans would only receive £3 million in cash. The difference, £2 million, went to the banks as fees, commissions, and discounts. The Ottomans had to repay the full $5 million plus interest, even though they only received $3 million. It was legalized theft, and the Ottomans had no choice but to accept because they needed the money immediately. The loans were also secured against specific revenue streams. The British and French banks demanded that certain taxes, customs duties, and tribute payments from the provinces be assigned directly to them. This meant that the revenue never even reached the Ottoman treasury. It went straight from the taxpayers to the foreign banks. The Ottoman government was losing control of its own finances. By the early 1870s, over 50% of the Ottoman government's revenue was going to service foreign debt. Not to build schools or roads or armies, but just to pay the interest on previous loans. And the debt was still growing. Every year, the government needed more money. Every year, they took out new loans to pay the interest on old loans. It was a classic debt trap. Borrow to pay interest. Borrow more to pay more interest. The principal never gets paid down. The debt only grows. And the lenders tightened their grip. By 1875, the situation had become impossible. The government needed £10 million just to pay the interest on the debt for that year. But the total revenue of the empire was only about £20 million, and half of that was already assigned to previous creditors or lost to corruption. There was no money left. The treasury was empty. The Sultan, now Abdulaziz, was still living in luxury, oblivious, or indifferent to the crisis. His ministers were paying. The foreign banks were demanding payment. The bondholders in London and Paris were getting nervous, hearing rumors that the Ottomans were running out of money. And then the final blow came from an unexpected direction. In 1873, a financial crisis began in Vienna and spread across Europe. It was triggered by overspeculation in railroad stocks and the collapse of several major banks. The crisis spread to London and Paris. Credit dried up. Banks stopped lending. The European financial markets went into panic mode. This meant that the Ottoman Empire, which had been relying on a steady supply of new loans to keep the game going, suddenly found that no one was willing to lend anymore. The door that had been opened since 1854 was slammed shut. The Ottomans were cut off from new credit at the exact moment they needed it most. Without new loans, there was no way to pay the interest on the old loans. Default was inevitable. The Grand Vizier, the Prime Minister, tried everything. He attempted to raise taxes, but the provinces were already squeezed dry. He tried to cut spending, but the Sultan refused to reduce his own expenditures, and the military could not be cut without risking rebellions. He tried to negotiate with the creditors, begging for more time, more lenient terms, but the banks refused. They wanted their money. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government had no choice. They announced the suspension of debt payments. It was framed as a temporary measure, a pause to allow the government to reorganize its finances. But everyone knew it was a default. The Ottomans could not pay, and there was no prospect of them being able to pay in the foreseeable future. The reaction in Europe was immediate and furious. The bondholders, many of them middle-class investors who had put their savings into what they believed were secure government bonds, were ruined. They had been told that Ottoman bonds were backed by the wealth of a great empire, by the customs revenues of a vast territory, by the stability of a 600-year-old dynasty. Now they discovered that those promises were worthless. The bonds were worth a fraction of their face value. Thousands of families faced financial ruin. In France, where Ottoman bonds had been particularly popular, the outcry was enormous. Newspapers demanded that the French government intervene. There were calls for military action to force the Ottomans to pay. In Britain, the reaction was more measured, but equally angry. The City of London, the financial heart of the empire, was shocked that a sovereign government could simply refuse to pay its debts. But the real catastrophe was not in Europe. It was in the Ottoman Empire itself. The bankruptcy triggered a political crisis. Sultan Abdulaziz, who had presided over the disaster, was increasingly seen as incompetent and possibly insane. His spending continued even as the empire collapsed. In May 1876, a group of reformist ministers and military officers staged a coup. They deposed Abdulaziz and installed his nephew, Murad V, as sultan. But Murad proved to be mentally unstable, possibly suffering from schizophrenia. After just 3 months, he was deposed and replaced by his younger brother, Abdulhamid II. 3 sultans in 1 year. The empire was in chaos. Abdulhamid II inherited a nightmare. The empire was bankrupt. The provinces were in rebellion. Serbia and Montenegro had declared war, seeking independence. Bulgaria was in revolt, and the Ottoman army was massacring civilians in a brutal crackdown that horrified Europe. Russia was preparing for war, seeing an opportunity to seize territory while the Ottomans were weak, and the creditors were circling, demanding some kind of settlement. Abdulhamid tried to stabilize the situation by promising reforms. In December 1876, he promulgated the first Ottoman constitution, creating a parliament and promising civil rights. It was an attempt to present the empire as a modern, constitutional state that deserved support from the European powers. But it was too little, too late. In April 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 was a disaster for the Ottomans. The Russian army advanced rapidly through the Balkans. Within months, Russian troops were at the gates of Constantinople. The Ottoman army, demoralized, underpaid, and poorly equipped, was no match for the Russians. The empire seemed on the verge of total collapse. The Ottomans were saved only by British intervention. Britain, fearing Russian expansion and the collapse of the balance of power, pressured Russia to accept a peace settlement. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 imposed a peace treaty that stripped the Ottoman Empire of huge territory. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro became fully independent. Bulgaria became autonomous. Austria-Hungary occupied Bosnia and Herzegovina. Britain took Cyprus. Russia took parts of the Caucasus and Armenia. The Ottoman Empire lost nearly 40% of its territory and 20% of its population in a single treaty. It was a humiliation that the empire would never recover from. But even worse than the territorial losses was what came next. The financial settlement. With the empire bankrupt and unable to pay its debts, the European powers imposed a solution. In 1881, the Ottoman government was forced to accept the creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was an international financial commission controlled by representatives of the European bondholders. The commission was given control over large portions of Ottoman revenue. Taxes on tobacco, salt, alcohol, stamps, and silk were assigned directly to the commission. Customs duties from several ports were also handed over. The commission collected these revenues and used them to pay the European creditors. The Ottoman government had no say in how this money was spent. It was an extraordinary violation of sovereignty. A foreign institution, staffed by European bureaucrats, was collecting taxes on Ottoman soil and sending the money to Europe. The Ottomans had become a semi-colony. Their finances controlled by foreign powers. The public debt administration was efficient and ruthless, where Ottoman tax collectors had been corrupt and inefficient. The European administrators were professional and rigorous. They collected more revenue from the same taxes because they didn't skim off the top. But this efficiency came at a cost. The revenues that the administration collected were no longer available to the Ottoman government for schools, hospitals, infrastructure, or defense. The empire was being drained of resources to pay foreign creditors. The administration operated until 1914, when World War I finally ended its control. But by then, the damage was done. For 33 years, a significant portion of Ottoman revenue had been siphoned off to Europe. The empire was starved of the resources it needed to modernize, to reform, to defend itself. The Public Debt Administration was a constant reminder that the Ottomans were no longer masters in their own house. They had lost their financial sovereignty. And without financial sovereignty, political sovereignty is an illusion. This is the central lesson of the Ottoman bankruptcy. A government that loses control of its finances, loses control of its destiny, the decisions about how to spend money, how to invest in the future, how to defend the nation, all of these are made by creditors, not by the sovereign. The Ottoman Empire became a debt colony. technically independent but practically controlled by foreign financial interests. But the story goes deeper than just financial control. The bankruptcy and the subsequent loss of sovereignty fed into nationalist movements throughout the empire. The Greeks, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Armenians, they all saw that the Ottoman government was weak, that it could not even pay its bills, that it was at the mercy of European powers. This emboldened them to seek independence. The empire, which had been held together by the prestige and power of the Sultan, was now revealed as hollow. The Sultan had no money to pay his soldiers, no money to build infrastructure, no money to provide services. Why should the subject peoples remain loyal to a government that could do nothing for them? The nationalist revolts accelerated. By the early 20th century, the empire was reduced to Anatolia, a small corner of the Balkans, and parts of the Arab Middle East. There's a bitter irony in the Ottoman story. The empire went bankrupt trying to modernize, trying to become strong enough to resist European pressure. But the loans that were supposed to pay for modernization instead became the mechanism of European control. The Ottomans borrowed to build railroads, armies, and schools, but they ended up with debt, foreign administrators, and loss of sovereignty. The reforms failed because they were built on a foundation of borrowed money, and borrowed money always comes with strings attached. The European banks didn't lend to the Ottomans out of charity or out of a desire to help them modernize. They lent because they saw an opportunity for profit, high interest rates, massive fees, and eventually control over Ottoman revenues. When the Ottomans couldn't pay, the banks didn't forgive the debt or write it off as a bad investment. They used their governments to impose a settlement that gave them control. The French, British, and German governments backed their banks, using diplomatic and military pressure to ensure that the creditors were paid. This is how financial imperialism works. You lend to a desperate government at predatory terms. When they can't pay, you seize control of their revenue streams. You don't need to invade or colonize. You just need to control the money. And control of money is control of everything. The Ottoman bankruptcy is not just a historical curiosity. It is a template that has been repeated many times since in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Persia, China, they all went through similar cycles. Borrow from European banks to modernize them. Fall behind on payments. Foreign financial commissions imposed. Loss of sovereignty. Egypt is a particularly clear example. The Khedive of Egypt borrowed heavily in the 1860s and 1870s to build the Suez Canal and modernize the country. By 1876, Egypt was bankrupt. The British and French imposed a dead commission that controlled Egyptian finances. In 1882, Britain used a nationalist revolt as an excuse to invade and occupy Egypt. The occupation lasted until 1952. It began with debt. In the 20th century, the pattern continued through different mechanisms. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank made loans to developing countries in the post-colonial era. When those countries couldn't pay, the IMF imposed structural adjustment programs. These programs required countries to cut government spending, privatize state assets, open their markets to foreign corporations, and devalue their currencies. The sovereignty of these nations was constrained by the conditions attached to the loans. They had to follow the rules set by the creditors, not by their own voters. The language changed. It was no longer called colonialism. It was called development assistance. But the reality was similar. Control through debt. And today, we see the same pattern with China's Belt and Road Initiative. China is lending hundreds of billions of dollars to developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to build infrastructure. The loans are large. The terms are often opaque, and the interest rates are significant. Some countries, like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, are already struggling to repay. When Sri Lanka defaulted on its Chinese loans, it had to lease the Hambantota port to China for 99 years. China now controls a strategic port on one of the world's most important shipping routes. This is debt trap diplomacy, the same mechanism that the European banks used against the Ottoman Empire 150 years ago. Lend to a desperate government, wait for them to default, seize assets or control. The Ottoman bankruptcy teaches us several critical lessons. First, borrowing for modernization is a dangerous gamble. If the investments generate growth and revenue, the debt can be repaid. But if the investments are wasted, stolen, or simply insufficient, the debt becomes a trap. The Ottoman Empire borrowed enormous sums, but much of it was wasted on palaces, corruption, and wars. The productive investments, the railroads, and factories were not enough to generate the revenue needed to repay the debt. Second, foreign debt is a sovereignty risk. When you borrow in foreign currency from foreign lenders, you give them leverage over your country. If you cannot pay, they can impose conditions, seize assets, or use their governments to pressure yours. Domestic debt is different. A government that borrows in its own currency from its own citizens has more flexibility. It can print money, restructure the debt, or negotiate with domestic creditors who have a stake in the country's success. Foreign creditors have no such loyalty. Third, desperate borrowing leads to predatory terms. The Ottoman Empire was so desperate for money that it accepted loans with massive discounts and fees. They borrowed 5 million but received only 3 million. This is the logic of desperation. When you have no other options, you accept any terms offered, and the lenders exploit this desperation. This is why countries should avoid reaching the point of desperation. They should maintain fiscal discipline, avoid excessive debt, and build up reserves for emergencies. Once you are desperate, you have lost your bargaining power. Fourth, the debt spiral is real and devastating. Borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing is not sustainable. It is a pyramid scheme that must eventually collapse. The longer it continues, the worse the eventual crisis will be. The Ottoman Empire should have defaulted earlier, or better yet, should never have borrowed so much in the first place. But once the borrowing began, it was politically impossible to stop. The government was addicted to foreign loans, and like any addiction, it ended in ruin. Finally, loss of financial sovereignty leads to loss of political sovereignty. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was a foreign institution that controlled Ottoman finances for 33 years. During that time, the Ottomans could not make independent decisions about their own budget, their own development, their own future. They were a sovereign state in name only. True sovereignty requires financial independence. A nation that cannot control its own money cannot control its own destiny. The Ottoman Empire was one of the greatest powers in history. At its peak, it controlled territory from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq. It was a superpower that shaped the history of 3 continents for over 6 centuries, but it was destroyed not by military defeat alone, but by financial collapse. The bankruptcy of 1875 was the beginning of the end. It led to foreign control, loss of territory, nationalist revolts, and ultimately the dissolution of the empire. The sultans who borrowed the money thought they were modernizing, strengthening the empire, securing its future, but they were actually selling it piece by piece, loan by loan, to foreign creditors who cared nothing for Ottoman greatness and everything for profit. When the last Sultan, Mehmed VI, was deposed in 1922 and sent into exile, the Ottoman Empire officially ended. But in reality, it had ended decades earlier. In 1875, when the government admitted it could not pay its debts, everything after that was just a slow-motion collapse, a long funeral for an empire that had bankrupted itself trying to survive. The lesson echoes across time. Nations that lose control of their finances, lose control of their fate. Debt is not just an economic issue. It is a sovereignty issue. It is a survival issue. The Ottoman Empire learned this too late. The question is, will today's indebted nations learn it in time, or will they follow the same path, borrowing desperately, spending recklessly, losing sovereignty gradually, until one day they wake up and realize that they no longer control their own country? The Ottoman bankruptcy is not ancient history. It is a blueprint, and it is being followed right now by nations that believe they are too big to fail, too powerful to be controlled, too modern to repeat the mistakes of the past. They are wrong. The pattern is the same. The outcome is predictable, and the only question is when, not if, the debt trap will close. I'm Adam, and this is the Prime History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.